Okay, our next speaker is a former colleague of mine in Learning and Skills Council days in the Southeast, Chris Cherry. Chris is now a senior associate at the Strategic Development Network, so I'd like to welcome Chris to the platform, please.
Thanks, Toby. Thank you very much. Good morning, colleagues. I usually submit quite a comprehensive list of demands whenever I go on a speaking engagement, which includes a full drum kit and keyboard combination surrounded by a bulletproof screen. So, Lindsay, thanks so much for accessing to my demand for a drum kit on stage. Feel free to come and join me and tap away. The other challenge, of course, today is I'm talking about the top 5 challenges for endpoint assessment. Challenge number 1 really is sticking to 5 and sticking to 15 minutes. Which is going to be a challenge. Thankfully, Sally Ann's mentioned a few of them and highlighted a couple of them, so there's probably no need to repeat old ground. So I'm here to talk about 5 challenges for endpoint assessment. And why am I talking to you today? Well, over the last 6 years, nearly 7 years now, I've been working on the apprenticeship reforms. It may or may not surprise you that the report of He Who Should Not Be Named was published in 2011, and I was editing that in the summer of 2011 in August, saying, employers writing standards, this isn't going to happen. And I phoned Alan Cavilla, who was then at BIS, and agreed with her that there's no way in the world we're going to have employers being able to write standards and lead from the front, because the system has never really conspired to allow that to happen. And here we are, 7 years later, where we have employer-developed standards that are usually 2 pages, if the font's very small and if the institute doesn't look too closely at them, and assessment plans which have been written in a bewildered fog of, oh my goodness, I'm writing an assessment plan as well as a standard? What on earth is this all about? And we have obviously learned a lot of lessons in that time, and there's a lot of distance that we've moved forward. So whilst I'm talking about 5 key challenges, actually there's a lot of good news out there about new apprenticeship reforms. There are a lot of positive stories, and there's obviously more than 5 opportunities that go alongside it. Clearly, endpoint assessment is a challenge. EQA is going to be a consistent challenge, and you'll obviously hear Heather a little bit later on, and obviously Darren as well, talking about EQA and the Institute's role. So over the last few years, I've been talking directly with a lot of colleagues, a lot of your, in fact, some of you in the room as well, your peers, your colleagues, your training providers, your endpoint assessment organisations, your funders. As an independent consultant, I can be challenging to absolutely everybody. And, you know, somewhere around about 3,000 staff, 900 organisations, almost all of the EPAOs, certainly a great deal of the employer groups, the bewildered ones and the ones that really wanted to crack on from the start. And obviously, lessons have been learned. Okay, more recently, been doing a lot of work on the Future Apprenticeships programme, quite a lot of the discussion around helping EPAOs become EPAOs and to navigate from being training providers, AOs and others into that. This is what we've come up with. I'm going to break it down into 5 themes. Obviously, apprenticeships are more complex than 5 themes, but sort of induction, on-programme, gateway, endpoint assessment, and certification. Each of those come with a particular challenge. So I'm going to start with induction. Why is induction a particular challenge? Because under apprenticeship standards, the employer has a different voice, a different role to play. In particular, the training provider's got some complexities right at the start, because they've got to agree when the apprentice is going to complete. And completion, as you heard from Sally Ann, is meeting a gateway. And in 11 standards, the gateway is pretty much an employer writing a letter that says, you have completed your apprenticeship training, which may not involve the training provider and may not involve anybody with an assessment or education perspective signing off on it. That's probably unfair to employers. Many are very, very switched on, but we can't guarantee that will be the case. And obviously, training providers are challenged against their success. And we've used the words timely achievement and success rates, which broadly speaking in the world of apprenticeship standards is a concept that can't easily be identified. So the first challenge is for the on-programme phase, and there's a series of kind of sub-challenges. I've cheated a bit and brought more challenges in than the 5, but we'll broadly call it on-programme. Meeting the requirements. Some have qualifications, some don't. But we've been told there's no qualification apprenticeships. How suddenly is there a qualification? Or they've got one, you haven't, theirs must be better. I want to do that because as qualification I can pin my hat on to something there. It becomes very, very difficult to manage. Meeting the gateway becomes a challenge. Obviously, we're working with portfolios and qualifications. We started off with no portfolios, then yes portfolios, then portfolios, however, we've got to think about them differently. The apprentice has invested a huge amount of time in doing a portfolio, which has either no status, some status, or is actually the end game as far as it's concerned. So it's complicated. It's a challenge to overcome, and it's complicated. Obviously, as Sally Ann said, meeting the gateway is a significant challenge, one which was perhaps not appreciated as being such a challenge 2 or 3 years ago, but clearly now, when you have an EPAO's expectations of the gateway, the training provider's expectations of the gateway, and the employer, who may be talking to neither, writing their letter saying you've met the gateway, it becomes a very complicated and important discussion, because a training provider's role ends at the point they wave goodbye to their apprentice, having achieved the gateway, walking through the door of the endpoint assessment organisation, who will then take over and administer that endpoint assessment. Obviously, other issues around the on-programme is where you pitch the training. Do you think, well, this apprentice can reach a distinction, let's do everything possible? Do you cash out and say, well, actually you may not get a distinction, let's not give you everything to get there, which is probably educationally a little bit suspect? Or do we kind of figure it out as we go and look for extension and work outside and around it and try and find our way through the woods? And our way through the woods, as Robbie Burns would say, makes endpoint assessment a real wee beastie. Okay, so the next challenge around the training to gateway phase. The assessment plan. Now, I spent 3 years working with assessment plans, particularly in the early days when they started. They were hard. Employer groups went, I don't know quite what this is. Well, I'll give you an example. A very, very vocational, as in it's all skills-based. The employer group wanted to write a 3-hour written exam as their endpoint assessment. And I said, well, you can, and you probably would get away with it, but why would you have an apprenticeship where almost the entire training period is spent making things? Test your apprentice's competence to do that occupation by making them write a 3-hour exam. It made no educational sense. But because they thought they had to, that's what they were going to do. And it was obviously very early days, and we can see the echoes of that in some of the assessment plans that are from the old Trailblazer groups that are due for refreshing. Some of them, would you believe, are nearly 4 years old, and 1 or 2 of them are 4 years old and haven't had a single apprentice on programme. So obviously they're aimed at endpoint assessment organisations. The audience for them is EPAOs, but obviously training organisations have to read them as well so they can interpret what's required so they can prepare adequately, especially if there isn't an EPAO, another challenge, or the EPAO that's present hasn't yet got materials and guidance and support for those training organisations, and they're trundling through with training, waiting for endpoint assessment, and it's not entirely clear what that assessment looks like. It might say professional discussion, it might say 50-question multiple choice exam, but those two themselves create their own issues. What's a professional discussion interpretation for you? Is it open, closed? Is it going to be a kind of pseudo interview, or is it going to be a very free and free-ranging discussion with an apprentice? There needs to be clarity in that. Obviously, some plans, broadly speaking, open to interpretation. There are some, you probably have spotted them, where they've got weighting and allocation of points, which are utterly contradictory. The weighting says 20%, 30%, 50%, that adds up to 100, and then you get a point scoring system which is completely different. Because the employers heard, we've got to put weighting in because that's what BIS wanted, actually we've got this incongruity of assessment, and the language of that and the calculation of that becomes a challenge. Obviously, with open policy, and BIS said this many times before DFE days, open policy can create these outliers, and it's okay, and we'll deal with it as we go along. But obviously, two years down the track, we are still dealing with some of those incongruities as well. Now, not all plans, excuse me, speak the language of assessment. If you're an awarding organisation with 100 years of history awarding, you've got a very particular jargon-led language that is alien to those outside. And if you try and reinterpret some of that language about validity, accuracy, transferability, and all the other aspects of it, it's quite difficult for these employer groups to work with them. And often, sometimes there can be ambiguities, and in some cases can actually be complete at odds with policy. And obviously, as we heard elsewhere, some early assessment plans are dated. Now, we've now moved to our dear friend, the Endpoint Assessment. Here we are with an Apprenticeships Challenges Conference, so let's think about Endpoint Assessment Challenges. Obviously, EPAOs are all new. We had, under frameworks, for good or for ill, a process that was at least tested rigorously over time with problems and issues to sort. Endpoint assessment comes along where we set aside all of that pre-existing knowledge, and there are new assessments. There are new EPAOs. Yes, some of them may have a history of assessment, many of them don't. It's completely untested and untried. We're asking employers to set aside, those that are heavily engaged in apprenticeships, perhaps their understanding of what an apprenticeship should have been for something a little bit different. Probably better, but different, and different brings uncertainty, and that brings suspicion. And clearly, if they're a levy payer as well, they have an automatic investment in cash, where perhaps in the past they may not have had a cash investment in quite the same way. Tell me if I'm wrong. Please do come and tell me that I've got it, I'm out of date or thinking. But only last week, one very large levy employer said, well, I can't deal with it. I'm pay it as a tax. I can't engage in the apprenticeship process, and therefore, I'm out. So EPA is untested, and it's generally untested. We have a very, very small number of endpoint assessments, certainly in terms of evaluating the success of endpoint assessment, but probably 2 years away from being able to do that with any robustness. Now, EPOs have to differentiate. Clearly, we talk about the same offer. If you had an A-level or a GCSE, it has to, broadly speaking, be within a very, very tight, narrow set of parameters, the same as everybody else's. And I do assessment all over the world. I've just come back from Saudi Arabia to do an assessment regime there, where it's very, very tightly controlled. Here we have endpoint assessment, where actually we're asking a commercial decision around endpoint assessment. Come to us because either we can compete on price, we can compete on the quality of our guidance and resources, or we can compete on quality of outcomes. And the choice that the employer is making, broadly speaking, the employer should be doing it, their training providers will help. The questions they're asking are not necessarily academic or assessment questions. They're about features of endpoint assessment rather than content of endpoint assessment. And because we've had so few assessments, we can't yet judge whether an individual EPAO is as high quality as they say they're going to be. It will come out over time. It's a challenge for the system at the moment. No tomatoes have been thrown at me yet. Probably one or two may come in a moment, or I get to play the drums and get booed off stage. Working with employers. Employers are often a forgotten aspect. Back in the day when the review was announced, the key plank was that employers are disconnected from the outcomes, generally, and that they are not perceived as being the ultimate customer for the training. Yes, the apprentice is the beneficiary, but the customer should have been the employer and often wasn't. So again, putting employers in the front and centre. And just asking them to write standards is not enough in terms of the challenge we're facing. So quite often, big employers particularly, but small employers, who are the bulk of those that I speak to, say, actually, it's bewildering. I hear that word a lot. A lot of business say it's bewildering. Whether they're levy or not, the process of engaging is a little bit tricky, and it's trickier than it used to be. And having to pay and how we contribute, and gateway and endpoint assessment, EPAO, and all our language that we're happy with, actually is a completely different entity. And the customer remains opaque in some cases as to who we're trying to serve. Where does the funding go? Treasury has ultimately said they should not be considered now the customer. That's been agreed. But who is that customer now? Where is the funding supposed to be used, ultimately benefiting the apprentice? Now, the levy has also got the potential to create unintended outcomes. Some employers are thinking, well, I've got roles that could be apprentices, but should I make this an apprenticeship? We've got, as you heard from Ofsted earlier this week, that 12.3% of apprentices don't even know they're on an apprenticeship programme. Actually, outside, you think that's scandalous. But inside, we think, actually, that's okay, because if you are a 52-year-old steel worker, I'm trying to think of the level 5 candidate I spoke to a couple of weeks ago, I've been doing the job for 33 years, I'm no longer an apprentice. Although I'm on an apprenticeship programme, I don't consider myself to be an apprentice, and that's okay. But externally, that sounds ridiculous. How can you be on a programme and not know that you are? And it becomes, again, open to challenge. I think Sally Ann mentioned there's a lot of poor reporting that's been going on as well. Obviously, some employers are not in the habit of making payments. That doesn't mean they don't pay. They're not in the habit of feeling that payment goes with it. And if for some, now, there are two sectors where this is absolutely the key issue. The apprenticeship itself is not the key outcome of the work that they're doing with the apprentice. So I'll say it quickly. I like the training. It gives me three key things, which I won't mention because you probably gather which sector this may be. But I don't feel any need at all to go forward for endpoint assessment. Once I've got what I need, I'm going to be going skedaddling from the process, leaving the training organisation with a funding hit and an EPAO that's entitled to take the endpoint assessment that's not going to get an endpoint assessment either. And it's the unintended outcome of the way some of the funding complexity operates. And then finally, leaving you all feeling energised for the world of apprenticeships, so that's usually my job, we have a constant scrutiny. This week, I did a quick check before I came on stage. under the hashtag apprenticeships, there have been 197 news stories, separate and new independent news stories about apprenticeships. It remains a very hot potato. It's 30 more stories than the health. And the health this week has had Boris Johnson demanding money for the NHS. You'd think that would be the bigger story, obviously second only to Brexit. But it isn't. Apprenticeships remains a big story. There's no particular reason why. Yes, Ofsted have spoken. Yes, there have been parliamentary scrutiny this week on apprenticeships and FE. But even then, it still remains a massive issue. Every time we have ministerial discussion about skills, it's about apprentices. They may not necessarily understand the full range of what apprenticeships can do, but it's still a hot topic for discussion. And that means the scrutiny means that there's tweaking and changes and movement in policy and a constant. We've always lived with that. Yes, change is a constant in the world of further education, but it's even more so right now. And you think after 5 or 6 years of policy, things may have settled down a little bit. An issue as well is who owns the success of an apprentice. You'd think it'd be the training provider, you'd think it'd be the employer, you'd think it'd be the apprentice themselves, but it is still unclear who owns success. Yes, training providers may be measured against success, that you have got 93% of your candidates to Gateway, nice measure if you can get it, and of those, 89% have achieved a certificate. Wouldn't that be great if you could actually report figures like that? But it's going to be extremely complicated to do that, especially in transition between frameworks and standards. They will not be directly comparable. They really won't be. Whatever may be said in the press about the success rates, we have to overlay that with a little bit of really just checking that's absolutely how it will play out. I'm very happy if you want to come over and say hello and say who you think owns an apprenticeship success. Yes, the apprentice, but who else should be, first of all, accountable, but also being able to celebrate the success of apprentices. Training providers will not be able to report timely success. I feel brave enough to say that now. It's going to be very difficult under standards to report accurately because you've just heard the issue about endpoint assessment. Yes, my gateway is 12 months and 5 days. I booked my endpoint assessment 3 months ago, but there isn't a freelancer available to come out to me on the day that I think I need it. The deployment, the logistics of deploying assessors is huge. Already some of the mock assessments that I've been involved in the Future Apprenticeships programme, 8 out of the 14 had to be rescheduled more than twice simply because of availability of the assessor, who was clearly willing and able but very, very pressured elsewhere. And it can only get more complex. So how can timely success be possible if we've met the gateway and we've now got a waiting period, potentially, with an EPAO that could extend, up to 4 months? Well, the apprentices had no further training, wait 4 months, take the endpoint assessment. Their chances of success have decayed to a point where maybe they won't be successful. So issues like that remaining. Okay, a training provider's actual success is meeting the gateway. We've talked about that one. And the standard proliferation that's coming through now, we really only scratch the surface of the standards that are coming through. They're not necessarily linked to skills, needs and demands. The issue there is that employers may be asking for something that the system can't yet provide. And to say, well, you can go ahead and create an employer group and get 10 friends or competitors, really, to come and work with you is a challenge. And actually to say that we'll go ahead and do that, I've tried it a lot. I've tried some sectors which are quite niche, quite marginal, quite interesting. To get together, there's only 3 employers in the entire sector and they won't talk to each other because they're so competitive. High altitude ductwork. Anybody ever heard of high altitude ductwork? There are 3 gentlemen in the country, apparently there were 5, but don't know what happened to the other 2, who climb very high and they put ducting into very high buildings on ropes. They have to be licensed, I think it's the Home Office, don't quote me on that one, to do it, and there are 3. So they've got to be the trainer, the endpoint assessor, the EQA, because I can't imagine the institute. I will ask Darren as he comes onto stage whether he'd be happy to hang out over the edge of the Shard and EQA an assessment. It's actually tricky, and the fit between the skills themes, the skills pathways that we now have, and the creation of standards may be a little bit mismatched. That's something about the system anyway. And I'll finish with EQA, knowing that Darren and Heather are coming on stage. I call it a complex, multi-layered, and in some cases the costs are opaque. And I'm hoping that Heather will agree with me that in some cases what this actually costs, there's no relation to the amount of money that may be available. And we could all say that about funding of apprenticeships, funding of EPA. The actual cost is not really yet clearly known. And it's an issue for all of us. So thank you very much for listening. I hope I haven't offended anybody, and thank you.